Hello, I'm Scott Slade, host of Atlanta's Morning News on 95.5 WSB Radio in Atlanta, and welcome to the Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series. This is the debate among Republican candidates for Secretary of State. Let's meet the candidates for this debate. They are in alphabetical order. David Bell Isles, an attorney and former mayor of Alpharetta, Georgia. Jody Hice is the representative from U.S. House District 10. T.J. Hudson is a former probate and magistrate judge. And Brad Raffensperger is the incumbent Secretary of State of Georgia. Now let's meet our panelists. Haley Mason is a political reporter for CBS 46 and Peachtree TV. And Mark Nisi reports on elections and Georgia government for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. For complete rules on today's debate, please visit the Atlanta Press Club website at atlantapressclub.org. Now, to start the debate, each candidate will be asked one question by one of the panelists. Candidates have 60 seconds to answer each question. Mark Nisi, you get the first question to Jody Hice.
Congressman Hice, Donald Trump did not win the 2020 election. This was shown by multiple vote counts, 3 vote counts, multiple investigations, court cases, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the GBI, the Secretary of State's office. They have all looked at dozens and dozens of allegations, but it seems like you still believe the myth that the election was stolen. How can voters trust your judgment if you're elected Secretary of State?
Thank you, Mark, for the question, and thanks to the Atlanta Press Club for having us here. Look, the big lie in all of this is that there were no problems in this past election. This election was filled with problems, beginning with Brad Raffensperger, unsolicited, sending out 6.9 million ballot request form, knowing that our voter registration file is some 10% inaccurate. Then we have drop-off boxes that were added to the Georgia election. We're now watching footage in the tune of thousands of hours of ballot harvesting taking place in this state. Listen, this past election was an absolute disaster under the leadership of Brad Raffensperger, and it's for that reason that I'm leaving a very safe congressional district to take on one that I believe is the worst Secretary of State, perhaps in our nation, but certainly here in our own state. Election security must be protected, and Brad Raffensperger let that ball majorly fall.
We are going to allow rebuttals here for direct mentions and direct attacks. Mr. Raffensperger, you want to take 30 seconds to answer that or wait till later?
Well, Jody Hice is lying. If you look at the election of 2020, what happened at the end of the day is that 28,000 Georgians skipped the presidential race, and yet they vote down ballot in other races. I'm the first Secretary of State to do add over 400 results of our investigations. We sent those to the local prosecuting attorneys or to the Attorney General's office. More investigations ever. I've made sure that we had safe and secure elections. We stood up in the middle of pandemic, security features like an absentee ballot fraud task force to make sure if there was any fraud, that we had people like Bobby Christine, handpicked by President Trump as U.S. Attorney of the Southern District, be on my task force to make sure that. But here's the real issue that we're facing right now is non-citizen voting.
We'll have to get to the bottom of it. Thanks very much, Mr. Raffensperger. There's 30 seconds or so.
Scott, he called me a liar. May I respond or no?
Well, the rebuttal comes one time, so we'll get to that a little bit later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Haley Mason, it is your turn to ask a question to Brad Raffensperger.
Secretary Raffensperger, you have said several times over the last 2 years that there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud in Georgia. And you have also, at this point, launched your campaign to prevent voter fraud with an emphasis on preventing non-citizen voting. Can you explain why this is an important thrust at this point in your campaign, given that data?
Thank you very much. I'm the only one on this stage that is fighting non-citizen voting. I'm making sure that only American citizens are in our voter rolls and only American citizens are voting in our elections. I'm the only candidate on this stage with real business experience, growing a business from the ground floor up. Well, Jody Hice has lived off the taxpayers for over 7 years now. I am the only one that has successfully outlawed ballot harvesting, and I'll continue to investigate every charge that we see. But I'm the first Secretary of State to do a 100% citizenship check of our voter rolls to make sure that only Americans are on the voting rolls. Over a week ago, Jody Hice said, quote, that non-citizen voting was not his highest priority. It's my highest priority. I'm the only candidate to draft and pass real election reform measures. Jody Hice has been in Congress for 7 years now, has not done a single piece of election reform legislation. I'm going to make sure that we push back against Stacey Abrams' lawsuit by Fair Fight, and we're going to continue to check, verify who you are on the voter rolls. Only American citizens vote in Georgia.
Mr. Heiss, rebuttal.
Yes, thank you. You would think that our Secretary of State would be aware of the fact that it is up to the states to secure elections, not the federal government. While I have been fighting in Washington to prevent a federal takeover of our elections, Brad Raffensperger was making deals with Stacey Abrams and opened wide the door for election fraud in this state in every way. You would think that someone would know that his responsibility is to secure elections in this state, but Brad Raffensperger has miserably failed.
Thank you. Mark, your question for T.J. Hudson.
Mr. Hudson, I've heard you talk about how you would like a paper receipt for voters to be able to bring home after they vote, but that is not possible or allowed in Georgia because that would enable people to prove who they voted for and potentially get paid for their vote. Why aren't you concerned about the potential for bribery of having people bring home paper ballots?
First, I would like to thank Atlanta Press Club for having me today. And to answer your question is, the reason we switched from the system that we previously had to the system we have now is because Georgia voters wanted something to take home, a receipt. I think that we should give the voters what they're asking for. That was the main purpose of changing the system. It was said that our old system was outdated and we wanted something to take home. Like I said, a receipt. So give the voters what they want, a receipt to take home.
Thank you. And Haley, you get the final question in this round for David Belle-Isle.
Mr. Belle-Isle, I'm going to pose the same question to you as I did to Secretary Raffensperger. Your campaign, one of the top points is to, quote, defeat voter fraud, while the Secretary of State's office says that there was no underage voting, 0 non-registered voters, no more than 74 convicted felons that tried to vote, and only 4 dead people voting in this election. So with that emphasis on voter fraud, despite the data, can you explain your stance there?
Yeah, very convenient that the Secretary of State has come up with those great answers. The Secretary of State, Raffensperger, he came out about 2 days after the election and declared that the 2020 election was the safest, most secure election in Georgia's history. Assuming for the sake of argument that that was indeed true, there's no way you can know. And one of the biggest issues that I have with Secretary Raffensperger is that he has failed to be curious. He's happy to throw something through the audit in terms of putting the same ballots through and getting the same result over and over again, but he's never once questioned his own results. And everyone has seen, with respect to the election, whether it be the drop boxes, the policies that were inconsistently applied, whether it was sending unrequested absentee ballot applications, whether it was signing a settlement agreement, we've shifted the burden in favor of accepting all absentee ballots, whether they be invalid or valid. Those are the kinds of things that have brought true questions to this 2020 election. Those are things he has failed to be curious about.
Mr. Raffensperger, you have 30 seconds to respond if you like. You can save it for later.
On the first issue, we kept signature match in 2020 elections, and we made sure that we could check signatures, the counties could, when you send in your absentee ballot application and also when you sent back in your ballot. And the signature match rejection rates on signature matching issues only were actually 11% higher in the year 2020. We kept signature match. Meanwhile, many states were being faced by Mark Elias lawsuits and the far left organizations. We kept signature match in 2020.
Thank you.
Can I respond?
We'll have to move on. I'm sorry. We'll be able to ask each other questions now. In fact, that concludes the first round of the debate. The candidates will now ask a question to an opponent of their choice. Each candidate will have 30 seconds to ask the question, 60 seconds to respond, and the candidate who asks the question will have 30 seconds for a rebuttal. By random selection, David Belle-Isle, you may ask the first question.
My question is for Jody Heiss. Other than voting and expressing your opinion, what is your political accomplishment?
I've got a number of them. I've got 4 bills hanging in my office in Washington, D.C. Just last month, for crying out loud, I personally, because of a parliamentary procedure, saved the taxpayers of the United States over $15.5 billion. That's a pretty major accomplishment. I'm an original member of the House Freedom Caucus, which is without question the most powerful conservative voice in Washington, D.C. I mean, we can go down a list of accomplishments. My big question is, why has Brad Raffensperger allowed this state to become the most insecure state perhaps in the country as it relates to election integrity? That is why we're here today, and those are the questions I believe need to be answered and demanded answers by the people of this state.
Mr. Belisle, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, one of the things I've heard, and I respect Mr. Heiss, but he's made a lot of comments about the federalization of our elections and the problems with H.R. 1 and other things that have come across with respect to the federal side. And what I would love to see is for Mr. Heiss to stay in Congress, especially with the expectation that Republicans regain the majority, and do his work there. But the issue of running a Secretary of State's office, which takes executive authority and executive ability and executive accomplishment, I'm the only one here on stage that has that experience to bring to this office.
Thank you. Brad Raffensperger, you get the next question for an opponent.
I'd like to ask Jody Heiss a question, because he's failed Georgia. He sat on his hands and did nothing to reform the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, which limits states from conducting voter list maintenance 90 days before a federal election, making it illegal to conduct list maintenance during an election when Republicans controlled the House. So Georgia continues to have one of the cleanest voter lists in the country. I've asked for eliminating this barrier. Jody, you had a majority in Congress, House, Senate, President. Why did you fail to introduce any election reform legislation?
Brad, that's just a ridiculous question. You ought to know that the Constitution itself says that the time, place, and manner of elections are left to the states, not the federal government. I have been fighting against a federal takeover of our election system. That is something that's to be left to the states. Why would Brad Raffensperger allow our voter registration files to be so inaccurate as they are? Is something that rests 100% on his shoulders. He has let down the people of this state. He has destroyed election integrity in this state. He has lost confidence of the voters in Georgia that we will have one legal ballot cast and one legal ballot counted. It is solely 100% on the shoulders of Brad Raffensperger, and it is for that reason that he, of all people, needs to be replaced in this position of Secretary of State. We need someone who can restore election integrity and to build back that which Brad Raffensperger has destroyed.
Mr. Raffensperger, a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, Jody Heiss did nothing in Congress when we controlled the Republican House. But here's the facts. Georgia is now recognized #1 for election integrity by Heritage. We also recognize as having one of the cleanest voter lists. So Jody Heiss, you were lying about that. But I'm also the first Secretary of State to do a citizenship audit of our entire voter list. I banned ballot harvesting, and about our voting machines, we audited a race. We also audited absentee ballots, and we audited an election. But I'm the first Secretary of State to pass photo ID for all forms of voting in Georgia.
Thank you. T.J. Hudson, it's your turn to question one of your opponents.
Brad, prior to taking office as Secretary of State, you did not have any election experience. Once in office, you as Secretary of State oversaw the largest voter system implementation in U.S. history. Why did you put an individual named Gabriel Sterling, who also had no election experience, in charge of implementing this system and awarded him a contract of $200,000 to do so?
Well, TJ, as a former probate judge who resigned in disgrace, your campaign is not based on personal truthfulness. But the real issue that we're facing in Georgia is Stacey Abrams is suing us right now today as I speak so she can put non-citizens on the voter rolls, and I'm the only one stopping her.
And you get a response?
So as a probate judge, I did not leave in disgrace. You need to talk facts. So look, I deal in facts, and here are the facts. Prior to implementation of the new voting system, Gabriel Sterling was already an employee in your office. He resigned and you awarded him a no-bid contract, a fact which was not only reported in the AJC, but confirmed by your own Deputy Secretary of State. Shady deals like this is what caused voters to lose faith and confidence.
We had the fastest implementation of a voting system in America, the fastest and the quickest. And then we rolled into a pandemic, and we then had an election there. Audits came out and said there was no fraud, and the funding was spent correctly.
Thank you. Jody Heiss, you get the final question in this round.
Brad, what an absolute joke for you to say that you outlawed ballot harvesting. You created ballot harvesting in Georgia. You said that this was the most secure election in the history of our state, but now we are watching thousands of hours of footage of ballot harvesting taking place, 240 plus people, over 5,600 ballot drop-offs, 40% of which took place between midnight and 5 a.m., almost 7 million unsolicited ballot requests that you sent out opening the door for all of this. Here's my question. Do you still stand by your position that this was the safest, most secure election in Georgia's history, in spite of the facts, in spite of the footage that we are all watching right now?
We need to get the question. 60 seconds to you, Mr. Raffensperger.
Well, Jody Hice somehow thinks that ballot harvesting doesn't happen at the post office, which has no video surveillance. One of the first things I did was outlaw ballot harvesting in House Bill 316. We also stood up in the middle of a pandemic guardrails because storage absentee ballot drop boxes were included and allowed in state law previously. So we made sure that the state election board set up guardrails, that they had to be on government property, had to be under video surveillance. And then we also stood up an absentee ballot fraud task force. Now, information has come to us over a year after the election, and we are investigating. We've actually even had to go so far as to subpoena them because they have witnesses, and they've refused to tell us who they are. We'll find out who they are, who they're paid by, and we'll follow the money trail. But we will prosecute, like we have every other case. I've prosecuted more people than any other state in the state's history.
And 30 seconds to you, Mr.
It's
Hice.
just absolutely not true. Ballot harvesting was created in the state of Georgia because of Brad Raffensperger. He sent out these absentee ballot request form, has virtually no voter identification, institutes ballot drop-off boxes, and we now watch on their cameras, the Secretary of State's cameras, that which he had for over a year, but only now is beginning to look at ballot harvesting taking place by the tunes of thousands of ballots.
Thank you. That concludes our second round. And for those just joining us, this is the debate between Republican candidates for Secretary of State. We'll now go back to the panel to ask questions to the candidates of their choice until we run out of time. As a point of moderator privileges, I may also ask a question or two of the candidates. I'll determine when a rebuttal is appropriate. Haley Mason, you get the first question in this round.
I'm going to pose this question to each one of the candidates. If you were in the position of Secretary of State during this last election, I would ask how you would have handled things differently. So last election, we saw that Georgia became the center of controversy as President Trump claimed that the election was stolen, claims that have been debunked by audits and hand recounts in Georgia. But if the claim was to surface again in the future election and you were asked to remain allegiant to the party, how would you handle that situation as the head of Georgia elections? I guess we can start from left to right, your right to left.
So is that Mr. Bellal?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, 60 seconds, please.
Haley, thank you. First of all, I have to disagree with the premise of the question. The premise of the question is that, well, the election has been proved to be absolutely sound because, after all, they hand-examined the ballots to make sure that it had the result, and that count, Brad loves to cite that. What it doesn't do, that audit did not do, is authenticate the validity of those ballots. All it did is record the result. And going forward, we have to be, here's the thing, trust in an election is like trust in any other relationship. When you lose trust, it's very hard to gain it back. And in order to establish the trust that we need for elections, we're going to have to be aggressive. I believe we need to go to hand-marked paper ballots like 35 other states with electronic tabulation. We need to get rid of no-excuse absentee ballot voting. We need to securitize our paper ballots. I believe we need a process where judges can make decisions on election litigation prior to the certification. But all these are steps as the next Secretary of State that I will take to make sure that not only do we have secure elections, but we can win back the trust that Brad Raffensperger lost the people of Georgia.
Mr. Hice, 60 seconds to you.
Yeah, I think David is right on. Look, if you have $100 of counterfeit money, but you continue to recount them, you may come up with the same count, but the fact is it's still counterfeit money. Brad Raffensperger never looked into the validity of the votes, the legality of the ballots that were cast. And had I been, according to the question, had I been in that position, number one, I would have never made a deal with Stacey Abrams and company to begin with. I would have never brought in drop-off boxes to this state. I would have never opened wide the door for voter fraud to occur like Brad Raffensperger has done. And now he walks around beating himself on the chest as though he is some champion of voter integrity when he is the very one that has lost voter integrity and confidence in this state. And we are at a point in our state right now that at all cost, we must make sure that the Secretary of State's office is one who will defend and protect election integrity.
Mr. Hudson, 60 seconds to you, please.
Thank you for the question. First thing I would have done is I would have given the resources to the locals. Instead of having a company from out west to send out the absentee applications, why not help the locals? Second, our current Secretary of State was absent. We heard from a staffer. We never heard from our current Secretary of State. He was too busy giving them interviews on CNN. I'm surprised he's even here today. I was expecting that same staffer to show up. I mean, he has this energy today. Where was that energy whenever we was asking for help, needing assistance? So just being accessible, that's what it's about. Leadership starts at the top, and there's a lot of lack of leadership with our current Secretary of State.
Mr. Raffensperger, to you.
The real problem that you have gets down to basic honesty. After we had the election, the first rumor that we had that there was 10,315 dead people, we knocked that down and said, no, there's 4. Then they said there's 66,000 underage voters. Then we found out there were 0. They said there's thousands of felons, less than 40. Then they talked about State Farm Arena. Then President Trump handpicked Bobby Christine, U.S. Attorney from the Southern District, to come up and look at that. He's debunked it. But that rumor still lives a year and a half. It gets down to, it was actual total disinformation, misinformation, outright lying. And there's not much I can do about that because Jody Hice has been running from one rumor to another for the last 18 months. And how can you have confidence when people that should be holding a responsible position as a sitting congressman should be telling the truth? I wrote him a 10-page letter. He has still yet to respond to it. See, I can walk up to Washington tomorrow and put my hand on a Bible and say, here are the facts. And I know that I don't have to worry about perjury. He couldn't do the same with what he's been saying the last 18 months in Georgia.
Mr. Hice, 30 seconds to you to rebut if you want it.
Yeah, that's just absolutely inaccurate. I've been on the front line of this issue in Washington, fighting against a federal takeover of elections for over 2 years now, while Brad has been giving our elections over to Stacey Abrams and the like. And we had a conference call, the Georgia delegation with Brad, urging him not to send out absentee ballot requests to everyone on our voter registration file. He did it anyways. In fact, the deal was already made with Stacey Abrams before that call ever took place.
You can answer that. That's a salient
As it relates to sending out the absentee ballot applications, what we noticed is that the liberal groups and Democrats were going to send them out to their counties, and the Republican counties weren't going to do anything in the middle of a pandemic. And that was going to really tilt the playing field. What we did is we sent out absentee ballot applications for the primary only to only active registered voters. And that was the only time it was done, but it was also to make sure that everyone got treated the same.
Thank you. We'll move along now. Mark Nisi, it's your turn to ask a question.
Sure. This is a question for Secretary of State Raffensperger. You have said that non-citizen voting is your #1 priority, preventing it, even though your own office did an audit that found there was non-citizen voting. You also have said that election security is your #1 priority. If election security really is your #1 priority, why haven't you read this report in federal court that alleges that voting machines could potentially be hacked?
Well, I know that our machines, we did a 100% hand recount, but the issue that we're facing right now as it relates to election security is when we passed SB 202, the first thing we had were 9 lawsuits from third-party left-wing groups and the Department of Justice. Now they've combined all their financial resources under the Department of Justice banner, and they're coming at us. So the client of the Department of Justice is not we, the people, the taxpayers of Georgia, people watching this show tonight. It's actually these left-wing groups, and they want to strip away and not have photo ID for absentee voting, and they also want to stop the accountability measure that we have so we can hold Fulton County accountable for the very first time. This nonsense with Fulton County has been going on since 1993, and I'm the first Secretary of State to get them under a consent agreement and the first Secretary of State to make sure that we have an accountability measure, just like Florida does with wayward counties.
Thank you. Haley, your turn to ask a question, please.
I'll ask this of Congressman Hice and Secretary Raffensperger. Restoring voter confidence looks different in different parts of the state. How will you work to make sure that the most populated areas and the most rural areas are properly resourced, trained, and fit to meet the voting needs of that particular area, not a one-size-fits-all approach?
Mr. Hice, I think she said you first.
Okay. Thank you. Look, when it comes to election integrity, the ground is level regardless of whether it's a populated area or not. And training, obviously is needed in all those areas. Poll workers, poll watchers, those who are managing the various precincts need to understand what the law is. They need to be trained in all of these things, how to run the equipment and so forth. So obviously there is a robust budget to help accomplish those types of things. The greater question to me comes into the broader issue of voter election integrity, and that is by opening wide the door for everything from drop-off boxes to sending out absentee ballot requests, having virtually no voter identification associated with these, with allowing ballot harvesting to take place. Those are the types of things that undermine voter confidence in the process that we have here, and those are the things that really must be corrected that have not been dealt with under this current leadership of Brad Raffensperger.
Mr. Raffensperger, 60 seconds to you.
Jody Hice has been running around Georgia for the last 18 months lying about our election process. That's what destroys confidence. At the end of the day, we had an election where we verified it and investigated every single allegation, and he continues to stand here today and lie. Drop boxes were allowed in state law, and we put barriers and guardrails around that to make sure that it had to be on government property with photo ID. And we stood up an absentee ballot fraud task force to make sure that we can investigate any allegation. And we have investigated allegations. In fact, recently we received a video about a man in Gwinnett County. We investigated, and the 5 ballots that he turned in were all himself and his family members.
30 seconds to you, Mr. Hice, to rebut.
Yeah, listen, ballot drop-off boxes were not legal until after Brad made them.
No, you have to read the code. They're in there.
No, Brad.
I've read the code. You haven't.
No, listen. If
you read
we
the
never
code,
had ballot. Did we have ballot drop-off boxes before?
Were allowed by
did we have them
the liberals
before?
were going to use
the
those.
answer is no.
No, the liberals were going to put them in their counties, and because it was allowed by state law.
We've never
Read the
had
code.
drop-off boxes until Brad Raffensperger.
It was a
we have
middle of a
never sent
pandemic,
out
and that's why the
absentee
liberals were
ballot
going to put them in their
requests.
counties.
Excuse me, this is my time, Brad.
We got to go back to one at a time, please.
Yes,
take 20 seconds to finish, Mr. Hice, and then Mr. Raffensperger.
We have never had drop-off boxes until Brad Raffensperger. We have never sent out to everyone on our voter registration file unsolicited absentee ballot requests until Brad Raffensperger. We have never had ballot harvesting in this state like we are now watching on television footage until Brad Raffensperger. That is the fact. And Brad loves to call me a liar, but the facts are the facts, and he has destroyed election integrity.
20 seconds to you, Mr. Raffensperger, and we're going to move on.
The liberal groups were going to be sending out absentee ballot applications to all of their party.
It's okay.
But also you would have had people getting multiple applications, and the counties had no one in the offices because we were in the middle of a pandemic. By sending out one application to all active registered voters, it reunified the process and made sure that everyone got treated the same. I followed the law and I followed the Constitution.
Thank you. Mark Nisi, next question for you, please.
Sure. Congressman Hice, you mentioned the settlement agreement between the Secretary of State's office and the Democratic Party. Stacey Abrams was not part of that settlement agreement. And what it did is required or gave guidance that more than one election official review a mismatched signature before rejecting that ballot. And yet, signature mismatch rates were virtually identical in 2018 and 2020. How do you reconcile those facts with the idea that this settlement somehow weakened absentee ballot verification?
Yeah, well, it did weaken the signature verification. It made it much more difficult for it to take place.
But the rates were the same.
You had to eventually notify the voter themselves. Listen, when you have nearly 7 million of these ballot drop-off boxes, 1.4 million absentee ballots that we're actually dealing with, it overwhelmed the system to the extent that it became virtually impossible to verify these signatures in any meaningful kind of way. The system was overwhelmed and collapsed. It should have never happened, but it did happen because of some very poor decisions by Mr. Raffensperger.
Mark, if I may, I'd like to.
Well, he
take
didn't
on
mention
that
you.
as
He
well.
mentioned me. So, Mark, I'm going to pick that one up because right there, I mentioned earlier that the signature match rejection rates were 0.18% in 2018 and 0.2%, 11% higher in 2020 for signature matching issues. The facts are the facts. And also the counties did not have people working in the office in the middle of a pandemic. And so they had a process to do that, but they kept signature match. And we also got the Democrats to forfeit their right to ever sue again on signature matching issues for the remainder of 2020.
Hey, let me just jump in there real quick because this is a big issue, and this has been the issue of the entire campaign. So with respect to that settlement agreement, what it did, Mark, was it shifted the burden. See, in past elections, you had one registrar at a county. They would review that absentee ballot. And if it checked out, if the signature checked out, if the address checked out, they'd put it in the accept pile. But in order to reject, this is why he doesn't understand what a lawsuit does. You see, yes, the lawsuit went away, but when he signed that settlement agreement, it shifted the burden from the same person putting it in the accept pile or the reject pile to requiring a 3-member panel to reject an invalid mail-in ballot. The inference was if you didn't get to that person within a single business day, that it had to be counted.
Time is up. Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Raffensperger, we've got to get on to other issues as well. And
well, the cure period that he's referring to was put into law by the General Assembly with House Bill 316. It was not something that we came up with as the General Assembly, the cure period
after the fact,
House Bill 316.
Okay, Mr. Hudson, do you have anything to say about this? I want to bring you in. I've got a question for all of you here coming up just a second. But do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Absolutely, because I'm the only election superintendent up here. And Jody is right. The ballot drop-off boxes was something that Brad did. That was something that he did. During a pandemic, I understand. But that was on his watch.
Okay. Let's move on. I have a question for all 4 of you, and it is this. What do you think of the GBI being given authority to investigate claims of election impropriety, and what should they do with that authority? And Mr. Belisle, let's start with you.
I think it's a great idea. When you have a secretary like Brad Raffensperger who refuses, even knowing there's 177 people, according to his own count, who voted twice, when he refuses to lead and champion the enforcement of our election laws, it's good to have more than one entity to be able to actually investigate irregularities in our elections. So by having the Secretary of State's office to have that ability and the GBI's office to be able to have that ability, that creates more certainty in the election process. And so I'm very happy and pleased with that result.
Mr. Raffensperger, what do you think about the GBI getting involved in election investigations?
Yeah, we have been on record to say that we support it. In fact, if you look in the 2020 race, we actually had to lean into the GBI to provide additional investigative resources. The Secretary of State's office has 2 people assigned to investigations. It's never been enough, but that's what the General Assembly has funded us with. When we did the Cobb County signature match study, we leaned into their resources so that we had 2-man team, 1 GBI agent, 1 of our investigators to get through that signature match audit quickly. And then also as it relates to State Farm Marina, we called in both the GBI and the FBI. And furthermore, Bobby Christine, handpicked by President Trump to look at the State Farm Arena. So we always like more eyeballs on something, a situation that helps get the investigation done quicker.
Hey, Mr. Hudson, the question to you.
I think that's a good thing having the GBI involved, but leadership starts at the top, like I said earlier. If we had a Secretary of State that knew what was going on in that office, do something instead of being absent. He wants to talk about signature matches. Election supervisors across the state are not signature experts. So start with these signature matches. As we all know, people's signature changes over time. I mean, but having the GBI in, that's a great thing.
Okay, Mr. Heiss, the question to you, 60 seconds.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're in this position. The Secretary of State's office has great investigative authority, which Brad Raffensperger chose not to use effectively, and as a result, now the General Assembly has recognized we've got to have someone doing investigations into voter fraud. And so I'm pleased that the GBI is now assuming the role. Unfortunately, they are doing so because leadership at the Secretary of State's office refused to do his job. And so with that, I think it's a good idea. We've got to have investigations. We've got to get the job done when it needs to be done. And I look forward to working with the GBI to make sure that we secure elections and we prosecute individuals with proper investigations who violate our election laws.
Okay, we need to move it along. And Haley Mason, you get the next question here in this round.
This question will be posed to each candidate. There are new efforts in the state legislature, the General Assembly, to completely do away with ballot drop boxes and mail-in ballots. That would shift the way counties have been trained to now have 1 drop box per 100,000 people. If you are in office as Secretary of State, how would you work with each county to ensure that access is still open, even if these legislative measures pass this next session?
Who would you like to start with?
Secretary Raffensperger can begin this set.
Thank you.
I think people are missing the point with the drop boxes because you can use the Postal Service right that. The challenge that we need to have, and I've said this for over 2 years now, we need to move away from no excuse absentee voting, which was put into place in 2005. People that are able-bodied should be able to go ahead and vote. We've got 18 days of voting in person. But people that are seniors and people that have disabilities, then you'd have no excuse absentee voting. That reduces the threshold, the number of people that be voting absentee. And I think that's the way to go forward. That helps secure the confidence in that. Also, we've passed photo ID for all forms of voting. We've moved away from signature match, which is something I asked for 4 years ago when I ran for office. We think that also shores up the security of the absentee ballot process.
Mr. Heiss, the question to you, please.
Yeah, first of all, I totally support doing away with the drop-off boxes. They're absolutely unnecessary. And now that they are inside the precinct voting places and only available during voting hours, if a person has to drive to the precinct, get out of the car, walk inside, they just as well vote. They're there. There is no reason for us to continue having these drop-off boxes. With that, obviously, it would require training certain workers to go back to the way things used to be before we had drop-off boxes, before we had this disastrous addition that opens up wide potential for voter fraud. Let's eliminate voter fraud. Let's eliminate doors and cracks that provide opportunity for voter fraud, and one of those is drop-off boxes. So I totally support doing away with them and whatever training is necessary for those workers. Obviously, they would need to be training to go back to running elections without the drop-off boxes.
Mr. Hudson, question to you, please.
I've heard from election officials across the state for drop-off boxes and against drop-off boxes. I never used a ballot drop-off box. I think we, as in the United States, have always had a ballot drop-off box, and it's called the United States Post Office. But in Metro, I understand. It makes the process a lot easier. But they have to be monitored at all times. They can't be in random locations. Senate Bill 202 did address that. It's about just having secure elections. So since it's in the law, I mean, we have to go by the law, and I'll just enforce it, just making sure that every ballot that's counted is legal.
Mr. Belisle, the question to you, please.
Well, so Mr. Raffensperger was clearly aware of the fact that post office boxes, the blue ones and the one at the end of your driveway, do in fact exist. With COVID, you know, the emergency powers that he exerted in order to authorize the drop boxes that were now such a big topic of discussion was basically on COVID. So the idea is that because of COVID, you should have to leave your house, go into a crowded area, interact with other people, and touch a drop box that have been touched by perhaps hundreds of people, rather than going to the drop box at the end of your driveway or at the end of your street. And so the process is that, look, we have to make these elections secure. The thing about a drop box is there's no record of anyone being there. You've got the surveillance that was supposed to be applied, but each county did it inconsistently. Some of it was motion sensor, some of it was just running, and very few counties maintained that information.
Mr. Raffensperger, you were named there. Do you want to take 20 seconds to respond, or?
Well, the real issue that we have going forward is the court case we have right now that Stacey Abrams is trying to stop us from having citizenship verification. Because when you have non-citizens put on the voter rolls, next thing they'll be pushing for is non-citizen voting. And that's what you're seeing in New York City, you're seeing that in Vermont, and you're starting to see that in other states like Maine and Maryland. And that's their push. And the other big push is the Department of Justice is trying to stop us from implementing and pushing back on Senate Bill 202,
That's the time.
which has photo ID for the very first time.
Thank you. Mark Nisi, next question for you, please.
Here's a question for everybody. I've heard, in particular, Congressman Heiss say that instead of certifying the election, he would have investigated it more. But state law requires the Secretary of State to certify the results that are given to him or her. Would you uphold Georgia law if you were elected and certify an election, even if you have doubts about its veracity?
And who would you like to start with, Mark?
Let's start with Congressman Heiss and go to Mr. Belisle and then around the end.
Of course, I will uphold the law. But the fact is, this last election should not have been certified without proper investigation. The allegations were tremendous. They were all over the place, and they still are. And yet, to this day, as you referenced, someone referenced a while ago, a 25,000-word report he hasn't even read yet about the issues that took place. This I would not have certified this last election as it was without proper investigation and getting to the bottom of what was an authentic election result. That was not done, and as a result, we still have millions and millions of Georgians who have lost confidence in our election system because there was, among other things, a certification of an election that was premature based upon the enormous amount of allegations of voter fraud that took place.
And 60 seconds to you, Mr. Bilal.
Yeah, so, the question is, would you uphold the law? Once upon a time, when my wife was in labor, I went down 400 in the middle of night, over 100 miles an hour. Now I'm telling this to the world. It's probably past the statute of limitations. But there are times in which the circumstances dictate a particular course of action. And the facts that Raffensperger continued to stick his head in the sand and reject that they were there, those facts that he rejected in terms of it being the fairest, most secure election, that is the time for him to have rolled up his sleeves, to have gotten to rather than jumping to a conclusion that's self-served, to actually be able to roll up his sleeves and get to the bottom, whether it's Fulton County alone. You have 103% of eligible voters in Fulton County registered to vote. There's two editors of that list. One is the Fulton County Board of Elections. The other is the man to my left, the current Secretary of State, and he has to go. Mr.
Raffensperger, 60 seconds.
Well, Jody Hice has been lying for 18 months. I don't know if the first one was in Ware County, but he put out on Twitter that he saw a forensic examination said that the machines were flipping votes. It was disproven, but he never, he took down his Twitter feed, so he doesn't want people to know that he said that. He also certified the results of his own elections and every other congressman, even the Democrat ones, on the Dominion voting machines, yet he did not certify the results of President Trump. Same machines, same ballots, and same voters. He loved the machines until he didn't. He keeps flip-flopping on the issues. The reality is that President Trump got more votes on those Dominion machines than anyone else got. Jody Hice has just not been honest for the last 18 months, and he's been spreading misinformation, disinformation, and that's what destroys voter confidence. Every allegation I checked out. I ran it down to the end of the line because that's what engineers do. We got to make sure that we have the facts, and we had the facts. And the fact was that 28,000 Georgians skipped the presidential race, and that's shown up, and yet they voted down ballot, and that's why President Trump came up short.
In 30 seconds to you, Mr. Hice, to rebut.
Thank you. Yes, this is precisely why so many people think Brad Raffensperger really is a Democrat. All he ever does is when he is backed in the corner, he starts throwing accusations to other people. He has done nothing but accuse me of being a liar since he's been here, because that's what Democrats do when they get in trouble, is start throwing other people under the bus with false accusations. Look, Brad Raffensperger is 100% responsible for the lack of election integrity we have in this state due to the enormously pitiful decisions that he made.
That's our time. Mr. Hudson, the question is you now, 60 seconds.
Absolutely. Give me the question again. It's been a while.
Will you uphold state law of elections even if you don't agree with them?
Absolutely. I will always follow the law. That's what I'm known for. Check my record, my track record. I'm about the law. But at the same time, it should have never got to that point. Brad just didn't do his job. You have to be held accountable. He didn't hold others accountable. So he has to do his job. That's why I'm running. And he's always throwing out that he has business experience. He has an engineering degree. He doesn't have election experience. I'm the only candidate that has election experience. We've seen how Brad runs elections. It's time for us to make a difference in the Secretary of State's office.
We'll need to move on. Haley Mason, the next question to you, please.
This is a good segue. Although the election is partisan, the role is largely based in data, facts, and implementing the law. Do you believe, though, that party affiliation should influence the decisions of a Secretary of State? And I'll let each one of you answer that question, starting with Mr. Bilal.
Well, at the end of the day, we're counting votes, and it should be, in an ideal world, you would have Republicans want to count votes and Democrats want to count votes, and that would be it. The problem is that what we see in the Democrat agenda is pushing forward a process that makes it vaguer and vaguer and less certain, whether it be, they were pushing for absentee ballot applications to be sent to everyone on the voter list for years. Brad is the one that brought their dream and made it come true. But the reason being is that creates uncertainty. What I said before about Fulton County having 103% of their eligible voters registered to vote, that's why you don't send unrequested absentee ballot applications to the entire list. So, yes, it should be the same, but it's not. At the end of the day, we have to make sure we have secure elections. I know one thing the Democrats throw around quite a bit is voter suppression. And usually in the terms of voter suppression being it's voter suppression to require a photo ID or to make sure elections are secure. It's voter suppression when you have no confidence in those elections and people don't vote because they don't trust it.
Thank you. Mr. Heiss.
Yes, look, at the end of the day, the issue is not who wins an election. The issue is, was it a fair election? And that is what has been thrown into question under the leadership of Brad Raffensperger. My candidate may lose an election, but if I know it's fair, if I know that we can go back and the playing field is level for all, and we're going to have one legal ballot cast, one legal ballot counted, then I can rally the troops and we can go back and we can try to make a difference in the next election. But when the scales are tilted, when the process is not fair, and is not investigated, and when those who violate our laws are not prosecuted, it raises all sorts of questions that must not only be answered, but must be corrected. And that's why we need a Secretary of State who will do the job to secure elections in this state.
Mr. Hudson, question to you, 60 seconds.
It's not about a Republican or a Democratic thing. It's a right thing. Party affiliation has nothing to do with it. Sitting on the bench, I never looked at a person that came in front of me and wondered whether they were a Republican or a Democrat. I always done what was right. And if you do that, then you shouldn't have any problems. Like I said, Brad has not done that. It's a lack of leadership at the top. We have to do better. I'm here to represent the people. I'm here to do what's right. Clearly, this guy's not.
Mr. Raffensperger, question to you, 60 seconds.
This job requires someone to follow the law, to walk that line of integrity. Very similar to our law enforcement, and I always back the blue because they always are following the law to do their job. And I understand that. But also, I'm going to make sure that we have the appropriate boundaries of accessibility with security. Number one, 80% of all Georgians believe that only American citizens should be voting in our elections. And also, 80% of all Georgians believe that we should have photo ID. Those are great, measures that we need to make sure we have. The number one issue that we have right now, though, is from the far left element. They don't believe in either one of those positions, and they also now are trying to make sure and trying to stop us. And that's what Stacey Abrams is doing with Fair Fight, to stop us from doing citizenship verification so that non-citizens can be allowed to be put on the voter rolls. We found 1,634 people, and we forwarded that to law enforcement agencies for prosecution. We're going to make sure only American citizens are voting in our elections.
We have time for one more question in this round. It comes from Mark Nisi.
At the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we've been reporting on how the Department of Driver Services did not actually have automatic voter registration over the last 15 months or so. They turned it off when they did change their website. And so voters were still able to register, but it wasn't automatic. There wasn't a default option to register to vote. Among people who support more voting access, it's a way to enroll more people, and among people who want security, it ensures that your name and information matches what's on your driver's license. For each of you, do you support continuing automatic voter registration in Georgia?
It'll be 30 seconds apiece because we're almost out of time. Mr. Hudson, let's begin with you.
Automatic? No, I do not. I think that they should go in and actually have to, because you never know. Voting is it's your right, but it's also a privilege. But in that is responsibility. And that sometimes you have to take responsibility and make sure that if your address is changed, you let the voter registration office know. So no, I'm totally against that.
Mr. Raffensperger.
The challenge that we have, I think people should be asked the question to have a choice. Would you like to be registered or would you not? And then they respond yes or no. And so I think that would be the update that we should have, and the General Assembly should pass that, the next General Assembly question.
Okay, 30 seconds to you, Mr. Billow.
It's like having an open credit card. So it should take a little bit of effort to register to vote. So when you register to vote, then you also are probably likely to take the effort to actually go to the actual polls and vote. But otherwise, with the leadership that Raffensperger has provided, in terms of voter issues. You're actually allowing ballot harvesting and, in fact, perhaps ballot trafficking by having essentially an open credit card and someone who's registered to vote who never intends to actually vote.
In 30 seconds, finally, to Jody Hice.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the proudest days of my life was going to register to vote. I felt like I was taking on my responsibility as an American citizen, and I was proud and honored to do so. And I believe that's the way it still ought to be these days, that people voluntarily understand their role, their responsibility, and their privilege as an American citizen and as a citizen of this state to step up to the plate and vote. I believe they ought to take that responsibility upon themselves rather than automatically receive that.
Thank you. Thank you all. That's all the time we have for questions. Now, each candidate will now have 60 seconds for a closing statement. TJ Hudson, you get the first closing statement.
Georgia has never had a Secretary of State that has election experience. I think our chief election official in this state should have some type of election experience. I've done it. Everything from paper ballots to shoot leavers to the system we have now. The other candidates have only been candidates on the ballot. I have actually ran elections. Georgia, you have a choice, and the choice is clear. A vote for TJ Hudson is an investment in your future. Why is that? I'm going to be accountable, and I'm going to hold others accountable. You have seen how elections have been run. If you vote for TJ Hudson, you will see how our election will be run the right way. If experience matters, here's the tale of the tape. You have a congressman running for Secretary of State with no election experience. You have a former mayor running for Secretary of State with no election experience. And then you have Brad, and you've seen how he run elections. Georgia voters, I need your help. I need you to ride with TJ Hudson as your next Secretary of State. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. David Bill Isle, you may now give your closing statement.
So now, thanks to Raffensperger, the Secretary of State is no longer a voting member on the State Board of Elections. You have 159 county board of elections that don't answer to the office of Secretary of State. You have the legislature that makes the law, the courts that interpret it, yet the next Secretary of State will be the chief election officer. The only way to make that work is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of leadership. As mayor of Alpharetta, we created a new downtown out of whole cloth. We took an 85-acre failed project, turned it into what is now Avalon. We grew our core industry from about 300 companies to over 700 companies. We created a conference center with no liability to the city, a technology incubator for technology startup companies. This is the kind of leadership. Being able to lead others voluntarily to get things done is the only way that office is going to work. At the same time, you can untap the potential of that office. I'm running to defeat voter fraud and to champion Georgia jobs, and I'm the only one with the experience to get it done.
Jody Hice, please give your closing statement.
Thank you again to the Atlanta Press Club for having us here today. Look, Georgians have been horrified by what happened in this past election. They have watched with horror as election integrity has been destroyed. And even now, the AJC is reporting in a poll that only 23% of Georgians are very confident that this next election under Brad Raffensperger will be secure and fair. Look, we are a country, politically speaking, that operates under the concept of the consent of the governed. And if ever the voice of the people, the consent of the governed, is violated or compromised at the ballot box, then we are in serious trouble as a nation. We watched that compromise under the leadership of Brad Raffensperger, and now is the time to change it. I'm Jody Hice, running to be your next Secretary of State. I ask for your help, for your vote, for your support. Visit jodyhice.com and join the team. Thank you very much.
Mr. Raffensperger, your closing statement, please.
Jody Hice has done nothing to pass election integrity legislation while in Congress for over 7 years. Absolutely nothing. But election security has been my #1 priority since day one. Only American citizens should vote in our elections, and failed candidates like Stacey Abrams are suing Georgia to add non-citizens to our voter rolls. I was the first to call for a constitutional amendment so only American citizens vote in our elections. The first to do a citizenship audit of our voter rolls to make sure that only Americans are registered. I implemented verifiable paper ballots in record time. I audited a statewide election. Now we've passed photo ID for all forms of voting here in Georgia. And we're also now cross-checking our registration with many other southeastern states so we can verify when people move or get on our voter rolls. And under my watch, Heritage has recognized Georgia #1 for election integrity for the very first time ever. I'm asking for your vote in the May Republican primary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. That concludes our debate. We'd like to remind voters that Election Day is Tuesday, May 24th. Early voting is underway now. Our thanks to our candidates, to our panel of journalists, Mark Nisi, Haley Mason. We'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging today's debate. And for more information on the debates they'll host this election season, visit atlantapressclub.org. And remember, one of the great things about the Atlanta Press Club debates is they are archived almost immediately, so you can go back and reference them all the way up to Election Day. You know, it's very easy to ask critical questions at times like this, but I'm also reminded that there are very few higher calls to public service than running for public office. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm and your commitment. I'm Scott Slade. Thank you for joining us for the Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series. So long for now.